Over to you, Michael.
Okay, well, I'm somebody that likes to have lots of conversation more than input, so I'll try and keep this fairly short and then make for more time for talking. My organisation is called Ratio. It's a 10-year exploration into how relationships influence health and development. And at the moment in our work, we have a series of partnerships with innovators in the UK, Netherlands, and the USA. We help them to learn about their innovation, and then we draw out the generalizable knowledge for the field as a whole. StreettoScale is slightly different. It's an innovation developed by us with a social entrepreneur, Charlie Howard, and a group of young people on the edges of society, mostly in London, also in Nottingham, and a few other places, but mainly in London. And it started with a very practical problem. And it came out of another of Charlie Howard's innovations, which is called problem-solving booths. Problem-solving booths, essentially 2 chairs in a street with a cardboard sign above both saying problem-solving booth, and a cardboard board above one saying problem, and the other above the other saying solution. And it invited people in the street to sit down and have a bit of mutual aid. And there's a whole story associated with that. The main kind of underlying story was about permission, that actually people are very keen to get involved in permission, in mutual aid, but they need permission to do so, to get away from the kind of normal constraints of society. But one of the byproducts of this was that people sitting down in the problem-solving booths were occasionally coming up with innovation, and we started to ask ourselves, well, how could we fund this innovation? And in trying to solve that problem, we stumbled on a way of building trust in communities that became StreettoScale. If you look at the next slide, what is it? It's a bank. It is a proper bank with a sort code and an account number. The bank is given its name by the local people. We put £1,000 into each bank. 3 to 5 citizens lead the bank, local people. Very often we don't know who they are when they start. They give it a name and set out a vision, which might be to get more people playing in the local park, to make more facilities for young mums, all kinds of things. And they recruit up to 10 what we call citizen card holders to spend the money. And that's because they're people who the bank issues credit cards to, with some denomination of that £1,000 on there, generally 1,000 divided by 10, £100 each. And they go out and spend the money. And all are linked together with the StreettoScale WhatsApp. So we're able to talk to them, they're able to talk to each other. And the bank closes after 8 weeks. So that's why it's not quite like Barclays. Your bank opens and 8 weeks later, it closes down. So the next slide talks a little bit about, well, what's the point? That's a recurring question on all the learning partners, with all the learning partners that we have. With StreettoScale, from a simple empirical observation, most of the money is spent on connection. We don't ask people to spend the money on connection. We don't ask people to spend the money on anything. In fact, it's up to them how they spend it. But all seem to be drawn to connection, something that brings people in the community together. But the primary impact is trust. Other citizens with money, projects like POP Plus that Matt is going to talk about, A Better Start, some foundations, the Tudor Trust, some local authorities, Islington, Camden in London, some others in the north of England. They give us money. They trust us with their money. There's no contract. There's no deliverables. There's no targets being set. They just give us the money. And we trust that money to the bank leaders in communities, and they trust the money to the card holders. And the community, of course, comes to trust the bank. So the point of this is trust. It's about, it creates connection. Money is being spent, but we think that the purpose of it is all about trust. This isn't a finished product. It's something we're learning about. We've gone through several phases of learning, as the next slide sets out. We've made a lot of errors, a lot of mistakes along the way. The errors and mistakes, as always, are the primary source of our progress. When we started off, StreettoScale, the kind of holding organization we set up for this, was the bank. And we found young people and we gave them cards. We put £100 each on the cards, and we found that nobody spent anything. They were saying, well, who are you? Why should we trust you? That was the question they were asking. So nothing got done. In the next phase, we got young people together to form the bank. And with them, we co-produced, and with the card holders, we co-produced how the money would be spent. And we spent many happy hours in rooms with young people doing this, and lots and lots of discussion, really interesting conversations about ethics. But again, no action. Nobody actually could get around to deciding what they should do. So in the third phase, we started using a concept that you might find useful in your own work. We found it useful in all kinds of contexts in terms of scaling innovation. And it's what we call box, Avon ladies, and stories. So the idea is you try and distill what the nature of the innovation is in a box. The box, of course, could be anything. It could be actually a physical box, as it is in this case, but it could be a van, it could be a video, it could be something communicated via an app. But the box contains everything you need in order to be able to get the innovation to people. They open it and they can more or less figure out what it is without any further explanation. But if they want more explanation, there's an Avon lady, and the Avon lady, not necessarily a lady, the Avon lady is a concept. The Avon lady is there to help you make the most of your box. If you want that, you can do it without the Avon lady, but if you want the Avon lady, there's somebody there to give you a bit more advice and support to take it forward. And finally, there are stories, and the stories are the things that make people want, in the future, want to use it. It's the stories of what happens out of the innovation that draws people in to want to do this without us having to force it on people. And when we started doing this and letting go and pushing these boxes out, lots of good things happened, a lot of good, a lot of money was spent, but also quite a lot of unethical spending. Perhaps in questions we'll come back to what people do when they spend the money unethically. So in the next phase, we introduced a WhatsApp group. And the WhatsApp group connects us to each bank. So the Avon lady is one of us. I'm an Avon lady for some of the banks, and I'm in communication with my banks, not much. And all of the bank leaders and the card holders, they're in touch with each other as well. And they're talking all the time on WhatsApp. And the primary aspect of this is we consistently push agency back into the hands of the bank leaders, and the bank leaders push agency back onto the card holders. And when you do that, you find that ethical spending increases, and it's reached our threshold. Our ethics committee said, well, you know, take something like evading bus fares. You know, what does that look like? And about 5% of bus fares are evaded. So we thought, well, that will be a reasonable threshold for unethical spending. And we've reached that threshold now in the last phase. Now we're trying to, for a variety of reasons, move to a direct relationship between StreettoScale and banks around the UK, bypassing, if this works, we don't know whether it will, organisations like POP Plus. We might still have funds coming in from POP, but we would bypass the organisation and actually reaching citizens. And I'll come back to later on about why we think that could be important. Measurement on the next slide. Well, you know, we're scientists, so we like to measure things. I know that's not always very popular, but you know, we can't help ourselves. StreettoScale produces lots of data. There's lots of WhatsApp feed. I mean, a lot of WhatsApp feed. The amount of conversation is absolutely extraordinary and very uplifting, I have to say. And of course, we've got lots of information on the money transactions. And we've been doing qualitative analysis on the WhatsApp feed. What happens when ethics break down? How much communication is there when ethics break down? Is there control by a few members when ethics break down? We can look at that qualitatively. And of course, the quantitative analysis of the money is interesting, what people spend their money on, but also things like ATM use. You can't withdraw cash using our StreettoScale credit cards. but people try, and that's an indication of, you know, unethical behaviour that we capture. And in the future, we think we will use machine learning to capture trust from these data. And I say it on the slide, we are learning how to machine learn, and I think that's exactly, we don't know how to do this yet, but we're working with some smart people who say that they think they can do it, and we're on a little journey to try and see if we can make that happen. Going on a little bit too long, so just a few stories on the next slide. You know, what happens from all of this, some great things, you know, divided communities, one community in Blackpool divided by a railway track, always getting at each other. Somebody used the money to bring citizens together from across the railway track for the first time in 8 years. My favourite, young people in a school in Walworth in South London decided they would build a bike, a fixed bike in their local park. And when you sit on it and cycle it, it generates electricity. And when you plug your phone into it, you can get your phone recharged. And then the obvious things, you know, very simple things, homeless young people going into a studio to make a record. Matt can talk at length about a really interesting group. I'm not sure how successful they've been, but coming together to try and save their local cinema. Lots of challenges, and we'll come back to these in discussion. I think I'm just going to leave that slide. Ethics and safeguarding is something that Matt and I are very engaged in. I'd really be interested in talking about that in conversation. Should we scale this? That's something I'm really agonizing about. It's been great fun doing this. We're testing out what the demand will be without any organizational input at the moment. We don't know where that will go. And I noticed in one of the questions that was distributed from those of you in the webinar beforehand, something that really interests me, really interests the work of Ratio in our development of what we call relational social policy, is this whole idea of contextualism, which is getting away from the idea that we have good people and bad people, 1 and 0, as I think about it, and moving towards a situation where we think about all of us, you, me, everybody on the webinar, everybody outside on the street, is both 1 and 0. And in the right context, we do the right things, and in the wrong context, we do the wrong things. And really, that puts a lot of onus on us as social entrepreneurs and innovators and policymakers and practitioners to think more about creating a context and leaving agency in the hands of the citizen. So that's one of the many things I'd like to talk about, perhaps when we get to questions. But over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Michael. Super. So what I thought I'd do and follow on from Michael with is just a bit of a kind of journey about where we came from in Plymouth, and yeah, and where we find ourselves right now. So POP, just to kind of do a bit of scene setting. So POP is, I guess, perhaps your traditional CVS infrastructure type organisation. So we're there in Plymouth to provide support to grassroots groups, organisations, charities, social enterprises in the city. And we particularly focus on that kind of grassroots level. The reason being is, 1, that's where our support is most valued, but 2, it's the lifeblood of our communities. But wrapping around that, we recognise that unless these groups are fed with new individuals, we won't have groups of the future. So we advocate and support the growth of active citizens and social connectivity. And then on the other end of that, as groups and social entrepreneurs step forward, we look at what they can do to grow, and we work strategically to ensure that the sector as a whole is recognised within decision making. We're really values led. I have to say we're a small team, so there's about 7 of us, all part-time except for 1. So we're lean. So In 2018, Esme Fairburn invested 1.3 million in Plymouth through POP to do something different. It was about addressing needs within the city. It was about bringing greater capacity to charities and social enterprises within Plymouth, and it was about connecting sectors together. So pretty much changed the world with 1.3 million, which is, you know, not an insignificant challenge. At the beginning, two vital decisions were made. One, that the grants pot, so the money would be dispersed as a grants pot out into the sector and not spent solely on POP. And the second was that decisions would be made by a participatory panel, which was called the Network of Networks. So year one came and went. I wasn't actually with POP at that point. And the main bit of feedback was great, but looked a little bit traditional in terms of grant making process, but loved the participatory element of what you were trying to do. So that came through an external evaluation that was commissioned. So I stepped into the role at POP around January of last year, and spent a bit of time looking at how we rescope the approach for year two. So just recognizing that, you know, we've had loads of change, loads of investment, far more than 1.3 million into trying to achieve these social goods that we're looking to achieve, and not necessarily seen a shift in those kind of macro trends around inequality and so on that drives those underlying kind of social issues. If we're going to do anything, we absolutely have to recognise that it's a mess of complexity, complexity of systems within systems within systems. And we were really keen to really major on one of our core values, which is about kind of trust and relationships, and really focus on people and relationships as being the units of change, not necessarily structures and activity. That was written last year. I'm not sure I'd write it in that way now. But anyway, so what we did, we kind of brought all that learning together with the Network of Networks. We then had a conversation over 6 months to look at what we would do for year two. And it resulted in 5 funds. The Community Fund, Network, Grassroots Fund, using the funding to kind of basically match fund and leverage the kind of POP values into other people's action, and then a challenge fund. So really quickly, so the Community Fund was about that kind of grassroots citizen level activity. We ended up combining the Network Fund, the Grassroots Fund, and the other funny one into one, and called it the Learning Collaboration Fund. Kind of made it simpler for us and easier to understand for others. And then the Challenge Fund was about, so that fund was about acting on the system, trying to increase the level of skills and awareness around collaboration, and doing that actively through the act of collaborating. So that Learning and Collaboration Fund was focused on the collaboration first, project second. So it almost didn't really matter what the collaboration was doing. We were really, and we still really care about how it is that collaboration is operating and who's doing what. And then the Challenge Fund was about those big issues, the kind of big hairy poverty, complex lives, whatever it happened to be. How can we use the funding to bring a different lens and a different approach to that? So anyway, so we decided that we would go with the Community Fund first. And it was all a bit of a whole sequence of serendipity. So the point at which I was scratching my head thinking, this is great and everything, but how are we going to do community funding differently? You know, other than just doing another small grants pot, which will just look like year one, but smaller. How are we going to do it? Well, Toby Lowe then introduced me to Michael. And I think within a week, I was looking at the email trail, Michael, within a week, we'd got approval from the trustees to kind of to go with this. And by the end of April, we had agreement with the network of networks to go ahead. So we tested it with selected groups just to kind of iron out the initial wrinkles, and we launched on the 3rd of July. Within 3 weeks, we'd allocated 47,000 and realized that we would max out our 50 grand budget that we'd put to this a little bit too quickly. So we ended up having to pause it. But because the funding streams were slightly different, we were able to keep the young people's groups up and running. So we then had a time of reflection that ended up being a little bit longer than we originally planned. So first of all, we had to wait the 8 weeks for the Street-to-Scale banks to complete. So that was the initial lot. And in October, we asked the network of networks, how should we redistribute the funding? And we decided to allocate the whole year's funding to Street-to-Scale and the Learning Collaboration Fund, and decided that the challenges could wait. I think it was the right decision. And then October to December, we planned that to be a kind of initial redesign period with ratio and looking at, well, what did we get from that round one? And then we hit a variety of different delays. Safeguarding reared its head. So we had an open conversation within Plymouth about safeguarding, and it's just, it highlighted some significant differences in the way we all see the management of risk and even the kind of measurement and assessment of risk. And then natural kind of events and conversations delayed us a little bit further, and then we were ready to go, and then COVID hit. So we're a couple of months delayed even after that because of COVID. So areas of learning. So there's two main areas of learning that I think that we've got from this. One is within the actual collaboration and around Street-to-Scale. So without having ratio taken those kind of first three phases, we would never have benefited from this. Having that independent view is critical to challenging our own experiences. So one of the really tricky bits of this was recognizing that we might be the problem and getting in the way. The other area is it sounds obvious, and it is obvious, but just working out how to communicate and operate as a partnership, and then the specific around kind of Michael's experience of kind of 30 years looking at child protection, child abuse, and safeguarding, being able to have that kind of really open conversation and withstand the pressure that we're still under. And then outside, and looking at how Street-to-Scale operated, because we used our normal routes to communicate this, we got people that were already in contact with POP. And those individuals and groups are used to funding operating in a particular way, and Street-to-Scale is not operating in the same way. So it caused some confusion. And looking at the groups, it caused more confusion for the more established groups. And then, like I've already kind of mentioned, I think we were getting in the way because organizations were looking to us to act as a normal funder. We were inadvertently stepping in unnecessarily. Well, not unnecessarily for those groups, but stepping in to a space that didn't necessarily need to be there. But what I just wanted to kind of end on was we had some amazing groups form. The link is there, and yeah, and there's been some really positive results. And then, oh, I didn't realize that. Well, that's clever. my presentation's automatically updated with my notes. Okay, so what next? This is totally note form. So we're pushing it out through Facebook, and we're going to test that organic reach, and then we'll be looking to the WhatsApp groups and conversations that then follow on for feedback on what's happening that might look different from that phase 1 for Plymouth. And then the other bit, the other point that I haven't quite kind of captured there is I've forgotten. I've lost it. So I'm gonna stop there. I just wanted to just show you really quickly the number of groups. I'll just do a really quick kind of scan down. Scan down the page. So I've just got to get the website out. So Jane, I mean, whilst I get this the web page up, I'll leave you to field questions.
Thank you for that. So if you've got questions, if you want to pop them into the chat box, that's great. I'm picking up some that are already there and some that people put on their registration form. So I'm not sure that Paul's with us on the call, but Paul and Natalie, who is on the call, were both mentioning trust and the idea of working on the assumption that people are actually good. I wondered, Michael, if you've got anything to say about that. Is that the basis of this way of working? And you're on mute, Michael, I think.
Oh my goodness, one day I'll learn how to do this. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think you can put this in two ways. One is we know absolutely from this work that if you change the context around people, you change their behavior to the point where, yes, you can assume that they will do good. But similarly, you could change the context where you would assume that people would do, very good people would do not so ethical things with the money. So it just puts a lot of the focus on what we call precision of the design and a preparedness to learn, because none of us know ahead of time quite what context will deliver the right kind of behavior. I mean, the very extreme version of this is we were the learning partner with Camarados, who started putting up cafes in libraries and various places to bring people together with varying degrees of success. And they ended up with a TP in a hospital without any staff and without any markings. And the TP was sufficient context for people to come together, to connect, to reflect, and it boosted mutual aid when they then went out into the hospital surroundings. Nobody could have guessed that TP was going to be the solution to that problem. So you have to kind of learn as you go along. So yes, I think the context is the variable here that produces both trusting and non-trusting behavior.
Thank
Just
you.
whilst there's a pause, Jane, I'll just
Your share.
Yeah. Just to give people an idea about what is that coming through? Yeah. So we've got everything from litter picking, Arabic school lessons to the real cinema, to teaching people about fish and workplaces, and then young people. I think some of the kind of stories around the youth groups are particularly lovely. So there was one that organised and supported a music stage at their local festival word got out about how lovely this way of kind of funding was, and then another group used the funding to go and visit BME groups in London and run a diversity project, which COVID's got in the way of a reciprocal visit, but I think that's still on the cards. And we've also seen groups secure funding on the back of having kind of tested something through StreettoScale.
Thank you, Matt. I've got another question here from Andy, who again, I can't see him on the call, but I know a lot of people follow these up by watching them on YouTube. And Andy was asking, can you apply the same principles to support a particular community mobilisation around a theme? For example, he was thinking around addiction and rough sleeping. Just wondered about your thoughts on that.
Well, Matt would probably have some views on this. I mean, I would just say, you know, from our experience, we have had groups of homeless people in Liverpool, addicts in Nottingham. There's more than that. I mean, our kind of, you know, we are drawn to people on the edges of society. So where we can do that, that's where we tend to go. So yes, we have certainly been involved in more marginal groups and found it to be as effective as working with general population.
So in Plymouth, we had groups that were looking at period poverty within hostels in Plymouth, and I'm looking for the detail of one of them. It was about getting packs to people in hostels as well. So I don't. If you wanted to theme it, you could do that if that's kind of what was limited. If the funding was limited, I'd suggest that you try and keep it as open as possible. I mean, Michael, I don't know whether it's worth rehearsing the conversation that was had around COVID, and do you have a kind of COVID themed focused StreettoScale and the conversation that you had at the ethics committee around that?
Yeah, it was a super interesting conversation. So of course, you know, as soon as as the lockdown was approaching, we were thinking, oh, okay, do we need to adapt this for the context? And we were particularly, of course, interested. There were already instances of people going to the houses of people being, how do we call it? When people are protected at home. What's the phrase for that? Shielded, yes, going to the houses of people who were being shielded, taking a credit card to do their shopping, and then of course never reappearing again. I mean, I'm sure there were about 1 or 2 cases of that around the country, but nonetheless, it became a fear, and maybe StreettoScale was an answer to this because we could actually provide the credit cards. And we sat down with a small group and designed something that would, you know, do just that. But when we took it to the ethics committee, they said, well, what are you trying to do here? I thought the whole point of this was to leave decisions about how the money is used in the hands of the local community. And here you are designing a process for the local community to use. And so we dropped the idea and we didn't go forward with it. I think the only other thing in my research, I've been doing a lot of research in the last 8 weeks for local authorities and foundations on how people have adapted in the context of COVID. And of course, what you've seen is this, one of the many things that you've seen is this huge burst of mutual aid. And it's quite interesting to see how much of that involves people spending their own money, using their own credit cards, not worrying about it too much, transferring money to each other. So a lot of the processes that are in StreettoScale, people are just doing out of their own volition in this particular context.
Thank you. There's a couple of people asking, I think Jeremy and Laura, both asking about safeguarding. I think that was one of the things that appeared on your slide, Matt.
It's our favourite subject.
I love it. So we didn't have any occurrences or events that happened in Plymouth. We had a bit of a kind of what I termed was a near miss, with a convicted paedophile kind of being on the fringes of a group, but didn't get the funding in the end. And we've gone through a lot of conversation about this, about, well, how do you make sure that never ever happens, and it's been the conversation with Michael around how important that environment is, and how important it is to ensure. So I mean, Michael, correct? I'm not quite as clued up on the detail as clearly Michael is, but in my simple mind, the logic goes something like, if we've got a set of services that are out there trying to ensure that the children of our communities are as protected and safeguarded as possible, yet we see that they're not entirely effective because they are missing vast numbers of children out and supporting other numbers that are not necessarily needing that support, then we have to start asking questions about, well, are there other ways that we can start protecting children? And if the findings in the research are suggesting that one of the protective factors, one of the most significant protective factors in a child's life is being able to stand up for themselves and have that agency and the wherewithal to say no, then actually you don't need that safeguarding measure in place, in the first place. Now, I know that we're not going to get there, but it means that it depends where we put our focus. So if we put our focus on ensuring that our young people are able to know who they are and are able to kind of take that responsibility and agency within their own life, then they are going to be more protected because of that. So the question then becomes, which is where StreettoScale is, how do we promote and how do we increase that level of agency, both in our young people and in our adult population, because you see it in our adult population just as much as you see it in our children and young people. So it just switches. So for me, it switches the question around from how do we stop shit happening to how do we promote the capacities we need for a healthy, safe community for us all to live in.
Thank you. And a bit of a supplemental to that then is a question from Natalie saying, so what due diligence have you done and how did you do that?
Shall I tackle that, Matt? Or?
Yeah, crack on.
So a really good question, and as Matt said, I'm very old, and I've had a lot of experience of working in this area for a long time, and the approach that we're taking is one of we rely very heavily on an ethics committee, which, as with all of our learning partnerships, comprises a professor of philosophy, as you would expect on an ethics committee, but also users of the innovation, people who have used and contributed towards the design of StreettoScale. And that the ethics committee is the mechanism through which we deal with these issues. I'm not saying that is the right way. I think it would be a very interesting seminar actually to talk about the contrast between ethics and safeguarding, and in what context. And it's really important to bear in mind that for the most part, this is a civil society innovation. The money may come from public systems, but it remains in civil society. And there is a question about whether the procedures we use in public systems are appropriate in a civil society context. So the ethics committee, what's different about that? One, it is very much user-led, as I said. People who've used the innovation are on the committee. It's not professional-led by any means. We're very much rooted in empirical experience. We report back to the ethics committee every instance of something that either went wrong or could have gone wrong, and we consider that and we use that experience to think about how we might correct course. Whereas in safeguarding, it's much more an a priori decision. You kind of think, well, what would happen if a paedophile tried to join a group? What would happen if somebody ran off with all £1,000, etc.? Whereas we deal on the empirical experience of what actually happens. I think thirdly, there is a difference in that, in this contextual issue of us thinking about people as 1 and 0, as both good and bad. Whereas in safeguarding, you are very much trying to protect people, the good people, from the bad people. And that focus on the context, of course, is again different. Safeguarding is very much about individuals, both as victims and perpetrators. Of course, we're all, whether you're in safeguarding or whether you're on the ethics side of this argument, of course, you want the same thing. You want people to be safe and you want people to flourish. But I think in ethics, there is much more a focus on the citizen, where there is a tendency, I would say, in safeguarding to think about protecting the organization. So if things go wrong, the organization isn't overly exposed, whereas in ethics, you're very much grounded in what is right for the citizen. So that's how we do it. I'm not saying that's that is the answer, but it would be very interesting to have an extended debate, maybe at some other time, on the relative merits, even whether the way I portray the distinctions is correct. I don't know. But also if whatever the distinctions are the relative merits of these approaches. What are they, and in what context do they best operate?
Thank you, Michael. That sounds really interesting, and maybe a discussion that we'd be happy to host here on Q. We can maybe pick that up and talk about that. Another important question seems to be around sharing the learning between the different projects, and maybe sharing the learning more widely as well. So what plans and systems are you using for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Matt will follow on, because, I think, of course, maybe it's more straightforward in Plymouth, but Plymouth has certainly done a much better job than we have. We have been extraordinarily disinterested in social media and communications of any type. We operated Ratio for the first 18 months without a website. We didn't really see what the function would be of having one. But it is absolutely clear that, if we are going to create pull for this so that people want it as opposed to just stumbling upon it, we are going to have to get much smarter in both sharing the stories so that other people might want to follow suit, and then also share the learning so that people can use what has been learnt in Plymouth, in Blackpool, or people in Blackpool can use what's been learnt in Nottingham, etc., etc. What we're doing about it at the moment is, first of all, trying to get a bit smarter about how we use social media. So now we've moved over to Instagram and Facebook, which I feel rather heavy about, but we've moved to Instagram and Facebook as the mechanism of communicating the availability of this to the population. And we're just trying to test that if you advertise, for example, in a particular postcode for this, what is the demand and what does that look like? And on the learning, as I've said, we're setting, we are trying to improve the way in which we analyze the data and making those analytic processes available to other people that pick the innovation up and use it for themselves. In very, very practical sense, we have a 2-weekly check-in with each of our partners. So we have a 2-weekly check-in with POP, where we say what worked in the last 2 weeks, what didn't work, and what are we going to do in the next 2 weeks to try and make it a little bit better.
So,
have you got something to add there about Plymouth, Matt?
Yeah, so back in August, September last year, we were trying to decide how we would fulfill a kind of evaluative learning function within POP. And we had a number of conversations, again, with a wide number of kind of stakeholders about how we best should do that, particularly as a funder. And we ended up deciding that rather than kind of buy an external evaluation, which we may need, but but wasn't primary there and then, we would appoint learning champions. So we've appointed a learning champion who, well, actually, I'm not going to put her on the spot, but Charlotte is on the call, and Charlotte and I had a conversation yesterday about so what. Oh, hello. So what's the role? And it's about the relationships, the valuing time, space, and the energy of people that we're working with, eking out the learning from that and connecting them together, and supporting a kind of greater level of sort of reflective practice, looking at the cumulative effects of those conversations, and picking out kind of themes, so our role kind of around StreettoScale is kind of doing that after the fact. So being completely hands off during those 8 weeks, but then just reconnecting with them at the end of those 8 weeks to say, so how did that go? And using our role as a kind of broker within Plymouth to say, well, actually, let's have a bit of a kind of StreettoScale celebration where you can just meet one another, and naturally start to build connections and relationships across the groups that form. So that's our plan. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Charlotte, but if you did want to say something, you could.
Unmuting myself. Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think for me, a new role has felt quite daunting at times, trying to do something new and different, and understanding how that's valuable to the people that we're having conversations with as individuals, but also then the wider value, coming back to the traditional reporting mechanisms, back to the funder. I understand that's different with Esme Fairburn, but really looking at what we want to be able to gather, and rather the luxury of me having all these wonderful conversations which allow me great insight, reflection, and are amazing, then how we share that and communicate that, but also connecting people, and certainly getting to that point now in COVID sort of lockdown time, to have that space to reflect on it. So when we're able to connect more with each other, we can then start connecting StreettoScale projects as an example to share that learning, and not offering solutions, not having the answers to the questions, you know, not having all the answers has certainly been something for me to get my head around, because it's really about guiding and supporting each other to find what works, and for them to share it between them, not always coming to POP as being the holder of that. So developing maybe a learning space and how people can share and start connecting and interacting with each other there.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I'm just checking my my feed again. I can't see any more questions. I don't know if that's because people are just too stunned and fascinated by the conversation that's been going on so far. Are there any more questions from the group? So maybe I can ask a question. That there is that that dilemma, it almost seems, between is this something that you can scale up? I just wondered if that's something that you would say a little bit more about.
Yeah, make sure I'm not on mute. This is the kind of constant dilemma really for us. I think that so the key variable in this, in the decision, is that there is absolutely intrinsic demand from citizens. We don't want to build something which we then have to, you know, try and encourage people to use. And that's what we're trying to test at the moment, you know, for example, through different methods with using Facebook ads and various other methods and so forth, to see whether there is intrinsic demand. If there is intrinsic demand, we then face the second issue, which is, how do we scale this? At Ratio, we have a lot of experience of working to scale innovation, and with you know, a reasonable amount of success in different contexts, working with the Gates Foundation in the Global South and working with relational innovations here in the here in the UK. So we kind of know how to do this, but the issue is, do we want to do this ourselves? And I think the answer is almost certainly not. So we want to be able to give this away. And then the issue then becomes, how do you give it away while retaining the essence of the trust relationship? And frankly, we don't know how to do that. The ethics committee are pushing us very much towards thinking about questions of branding, because we know brand is really important in a trust relationship. We don't know very much about that, so we've got to try and figure it out. We're pretty confident that if you began to franchise this out, to civil society organizations or public systems, it would be very difficult to maintain the trust relationship. So 2 stages in the process. One, is there intrinsic demand? Is there real pull for this? And secondly, how would we do it if we don't do it ourselves?
Do you have anything to add to that, Matt?
No, so whenever we're talking about StreettoScale, I've always got Simon from Torbay in my ear, who so when they've taken a development approach, actually money hasn't played a particularly important role at all, and people have managed to kind of find a wherewithal within their own kind of networks and so on. So I'm really aware that what we're doing is we're testing kind of community development, citizen action, and stimulating citizen action through the catalyzing effect of having some money on the table. So I'm with Michael on the first bit. Is there an intrinsic demand? And if there is, it kind of the second one is almost like, well, we just need to find some funding from somewhere. And if we need to buy something in nationally, because that's where the arm's length needs to extend to, then that's a second order problem at that stage. But I would hope that in some way POP might be able to kind of fulfill that, or a local funder will fulfill that in a way that makes sense. But because the extension of trust is much easier to imagine at a local level, because I think it's important, I think I understand it, and therefore communicating that to others through a set of relationships that we hold already, rather than having to generate relationships at a kind of national level that you might not already have access to.
Thank you. And a very quick question just to finish on from Jeremy, just asking about your experience of large institutional funders. In a minute.
Well, one of the largest institutional funders in the world, in fact, is interested in putting some money into this. That they reckon if they put in 1% of their overall expenditure, that would give us about 7 million a year to distribute. So we could do that, and we could do a lot of good with that, or we could kill it stone dead. And so we're just mulling that over, deciding what to do. I could say more, but you invited a short answer, so I'm keeping it short.
I did, because I'm aware that particularly this audience tends to leave on time, and I would hate them to miss any part of this conversation. So Matt, have you got anything to add to that about experience of institutional funders?
No, we benefit hugely from the relationship we've got with Esme Fairburn, who have basically entrusted us to make decisions. And Jeremy, it's the same. It'll be the same challenges that you find with other conversations about losing control and different forms of accountability and different forms of making sure money is spent in the right way. And at the moment, it's form-based. You tell us what you are going to spend the money on. If you don't spend the money in year 2 that you said you were going to spend it in at the start, then we call that a fail. rather than adaptation and good decision making along the way. So it wraps itself all in that accountability, decision making conundrum.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to say thank you very, very much to Michael and to Matt for sharing that. I think there's a bigger conversation here potentially as well. I'm noting some interest in the chat thread, particularly around the ethics assurance questions that people are very keen to follow up on. If you would like to access more information, I posted the link to our Q special interest group. Please join us there. We have a provisional date for Simon, who unfortunately had to cancel today due to the pressures of work, so more information to follow about that. Have I missed anything, Matthew?
Matthews. There are other good Zooms coming up on well-being, and there's one about mindfulness and organisational change if people are interested, so look out for them. Not from this SIG, but from other Q groups.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think with what possibly even 15 seconds to spare, I'm going to say thank you very much, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks everyone.